The envelope hit Elena across the face before she could even read what was inside it. Her sister Vivian's hand had moved so fast, so casual, like swatting a fly, that it took Elena a full second to understand what had just happened. The paper cut stung along her cheekbone. Around the dining table, her other two sisters went completely silent. Then Vivian smiled, slow and satisfied, and said, "We sent your name in, to some rancher in Wyoming. Don't worry, when he sees you, he'll send you right back." The laughter that followed wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. If you had been sitting in that room, if that had been your family laughing at you like you were a punchline they'd been saving for years, what would you have done? Before we go any further, if stories like this one move you, if they make you feel something real, please subscribe to this channel and follow Elena's story all the way to the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning, because what happened next changed everything. The Bennett household ran on a kind of cruelty that never raised its voice. It wasn't the screaming kind of cruelty, the kind neighbors might overhear through thin walls and whisper about at church. It was quieter than that, and in many ways that made it worse. It lived in the pauses, in the way a compliment would circle the table and simply skip over Elena like she wasn't sitting there. In the way her mother called all three of her sisters by name in the same sentence and then added "and Elena" at the very end, almost as an afterthought, the way you might remember to include a piece of furniture when you're describing a room. Elena was 26 years old, and she had spent the better part of her life becoming invisible on purpose. Not because she was weak. That was the part nobody ever understood, least of all her own family. She had learned, somewhere around the age of 9 or 10, that being invisible was the only armor that worked in this house. Vivian was the beautiful one. Rosalind was the clever one. Or at least she played the part so convincingly that no one questioned it. Clara was the youngest, and youngest daughters in households like this one were always adored simply for existing. Elena was the one in the middle. Not middle in birth order, but middle in every other sense of the word. Neither the most striking nor the least. Neither loud nor silent enough to be remarkable in her silence. She existed in the space between things. She repaired the clothes. She balanced the household accounts in a small leather notebook her father had given her when she was 12, which was the last truly kind thing he'd done before. The drinking erased most of his gentler qualities. She cooked when the cook was sick. She sat up with Clara during fevers and made sure Rosalind's dresses were pressed before her suitors arrived, and kept track of which bills were overdue and which creditors could be put off another month without real consequence. Nobody thanked her for any of it, not because they were monsters exactly, because they didn't see it. That was the more honest answer. To thank someone, you first have to notice them. It was an ordinary Thursday morning in late October when the first crack appeared in the life Elena had so carefully made invisible. She was in the kitchen, not the grand kitchen, but the narrow back room where the actual work happened, going through the household ledger when she heard her sisters' voices carrying in from the parlor. Vivian's voice had a particular quality when she was scheming. It got lighter, almost girlish, and she laughed more often than usual, but the laugh never quite reached anything genuine. Elena recognized that voice the way a sailor recognizes a certain color in the clouds. The ranchman's correspondent. That was what she heard Vivian say. "It's in the back of the newspaper. Men out west advertising for wives. Can you imagine?" Rosalind's response was low and amused. "Desperate men in the middle of nowhere. One of them is apparently very wealthy." A pause. The sound of paper rustling. "A Mr. Gideon Mercer of Powder River County, Wyoming, owns 15,000 acres, looking for a woman of honest character and practical disposition." Vivian's voice took on a mocking edge at the last phrase. Honest character, practical disposition. Clara giggled. She was the youngest, and she always giggled when Vivian wanted her to. "We should send him Elena." Vivian said it like it was the most natural conclusion in the world. "She's got an honest character. Lord knows she's practical enough." Elena stopped writing. Her pen rested on the page, but she didn't lift her head. She recognized this too, the specific shape of a joke being built around her. "He'd send her right back," Rosalind said, though her voice suggested she found the idea entertaining rather than objectionable. "Exactly." Vivian sounded delighted. "That's what makes it funny." Elena turned back to her numbers. She had learned a long time ago that the best response to her sister's amusements was no response at all. It denied them the reaction they were building toward. She finished the column she was working on, closed the ledger, and went upstairs to start mending the loose hem on Clara's winter coat. She did not think about Gideon Mercer of Powder River County. She did not allow herself to. 3 weeks passed. The first sign that something had gone further than idle talk was when Vivian asked her, with an expression of exaggerated sweetness that Elena recognized immediately as dangerous, whether she had received any interesting correspondence lately. No, Elena said. She was darning a sock at the time. Vivian's smile widened by a fraction. The second sign came 4 days later, in the form of a cream-colored envelope addressed in careful, unfamiliar handwriting to Miss Elena Bennett. She found it on the hall table with the rest of the post. She almost didn't pick it up. Her name on an envelope was unusual enough to give her a moment of genuine disorientation. When she finally opened it, sitting alone in the back room with the afternoon light going gray through the small window, her first response was not what she might have predicted. She wasn't embarrassed. She wasn't angry. She was startled by how earnest it was. Gideon Mercer wrote the way men his age rarely wrote, without pretension, without the elaborate courtesy that usually meant nothing at all. The letter was 2 pages long, written on good paper but with no particular elegance. He said he was 41. He said he had a daughter named Lucy who was 7 years old and who had not spoken more than a dozen words a day since her mother left 3 years ago. He said he did not need a beautiful wife. I was specific about this in a way that was almost blunt. What he needed, and he used the word needed rather than wanted, which Elena noticed, was a woman who would not find Wyoming disappointing, who could manage a household under genuine difficulty, and who would be honest with him even when honesty was uncomfortable. He said he had received dozens of letters from women who described themselves in terms that read like advertisements, and that he was tired of trying to guess what was real underneath the performance. He had chosen her letter, he said, because it was the only one that read like a real person had written it. Elena read that line twice. Then she put the letter down flat on the table and sat with it for a long while. The problem was this: she had not written that letter. Whatever her sisters had sent in her name, and she still didn't know exactly what words Vivian had chosen, it had apparently done something her actual self had never managed to do. It had made a stranger believe she was worth knowing. She had 2 choices. She could write back and correct the misunderstanding, expose the joke, embarrass her sisters, save this distant rancher from wasting any further time, and return to her invisible life in the back room with the ledger. Or she could answer as herself. She sat with that question until the lamp needed trimming and the kitchen had gone cold. Then she picked up her pen. She did not try to be charming. She had no particular talent for charm, and she knew it. She wrote to him the same way she kept her accounts, plainly, accurately, without decoration. She told him that she managed a household that would have fallen apart years ago without her. She told him she was competent at needlework and bookkeeping, but had no accomplishments of the performative kind. No painting, no particularly refined piano, no French worth mentioning. She told him she was not considered beautiful by her family or anyone else she could think of, and that she was telling him this not because it seemed like the most appealing quality to advertise, but because he had specifically asked for honesty, and this seemed like as honest a starting point as any. She posted the letter herself. She didn't tell her sisters. She expected nothing. She told herself very firmly that she expected nothing. His reply came in 10 days. Then hers went back in 4. Then his arrived in 8. By January, they were exchanging 2 letters a month. By February, 3. His handwriting loosened somewhere around the 4th letter, and she noticed it because she was the kind of person who noticed things like that. He started answering questions she hadn't quite asked directly, which meant he was reading her letters carefully enough to hear what was underneath the words. That meant something to her, though she would not let herself calculate exactly how much. He told her about the land. Not romantically. He wasn't a romantic man, that was clear. But specifically, the way a person describes something they've worked hard for and don't take lightly. 15,000 acres. The winter that had killed 40% of his cattle 2 years ago, and how he'd rebuilt from it. The particular challenge of finding reliable men who would stay through winter. Lucy, who sat at the dinner table and ate neatly and said almost nothing, and watched adults with eyes that were, in Gideon's words, too old for her face. She told him about the accounts. She told him about the time she had found a 6-month-old bill the family had forgotten entirely, and had negotiated it down by a third through 3 letters of polite but persistent correspondence with the creditor. She told him about Clara's fever last spring and the 3 nights she'd sat up with her. She did not tell him that no one had noticed she'd done it, but she suspected he read that part anyway. In March, his letter did not contain small talk. It was half the usual length, and it said, "I would like to propose marriage. Not because I believe we know everything necessary about each other, but because I believe we have been honest with each other, which is more than most people manage. I'm not asking you to give up anything. I understand this is a considerable thing I'm asking." She read the letter standing at the hall table. She could hear Vivian in the parlor talking about the Hartley family's invitation to a dinner party. She could hear her mother's appreciative murmur. She could hear the whole familiar music of a life she had never quite belonged to, playing itself out without her. She wrote back the same evening, "Yes, I will come." She did not tell her sisters until the day before the train. She almost wished she hadn't told them at all, not because she feared their reaction, exactly, but because what followed was worse than she'd expected, even by their standards. Vivian's expression moved through surprise, confusion, and then settled into something that might have been contempt, but was trying to dress itself up as concern. "Elena." She said the name the way you'd say the name of someone you'd just caught doing something embarrassing. "You cannot be serious." "I'm very serious. You've never even met the man. I know him better than you know most people you've spent years sitting next to." Rosalind looked at their mother. Their mother looked at her hands, which was what she did when she didn't want to take a side. "He sent for you as a joke," Vivian said. Her voice had gone flat. This was the more dangerous Vivian, not the one who laughed, but the one who dropped the performance. "We sent your name in as a joke, Elena. The letter you supposedly sent him?" "I wrote it. You don't honestly believe he wants you. He wants whoever he thought you were." Elena stood in the parlor doorway. She had her coat on already because she had known, walking into this room, that she would not want to stay long. "Then I'll have to make sure he doesn't regret what he finds instead," she said. She left before anyone could answer. She spent that evening packing 2 bags, everything practical she owned, and almost nothing else. She was not someone who owned many impractical things. She kept the letters in a bundle tied with plain kitchen string because she didn't own ribbon and refused to spend money on it now. The morning of the train, nobody woke up early to see her off. She didn't blame them for it. She didn't require it. She carried her bags down the stairs by herself in the pre-dawn dark and sat on the front step in her coat and waited for the cab she'd arranged herself, and thought about a man in Wyoming who had asked for honesty and received it, even if by accident. The train pulled out of the station while the sky was still the color of iron. Elena did not look back. Not because she was brave, exactly. Because she had spent her entire life in that direction, and there was nothing back there she hadn't already seen. She had 1 bundle of letters and 2 bags and $23 she'd saved in a tin box over 4 years, a little at a time. From household money she'd managed carefully enough to create small margins no one else had noticed. She hadn't saved it for this. She hadn't saved it for anything specific. She'd saved it the way people who have never felt entirely safe save things. Not for a plan, but against the possibility that one day they might need to leave quickly and have something to leave with. She pulled the top letter from the bundle and read it again on the train, not for the words, she had all of them memorized by now, but for the handwriting. The way the letters loosened as the page went on. The way he'd written Lucy's name. The train moved west through bare February fields, and the sky outside the window went from iron to the palest possible gray, and then, eventually, to something that might have been the beginning of color. Elena tucked the letter back into the bundle. She had made the only decision she knew how to make, the honest one. Whatever Wyoming turned out to be, whatever Gideon Mercer turned out to be, she had walked into this with nothing hidden. That, she told herself, had to count for something. She just didn't know yet whether it would be enough. The train pulled into Clearwater Station on a Tuesday afternoon, and the first thing Elena noticed about Wyoming was how much sky there was. She had known, intellectually, that the West was wide. She had read descriptions, but reading about open land and standing underneath it were 2 entirely different experiences, and for a moment, stepping down from the train car with her 2 bags and her bundle of letters, she felt something close to vertigo. Not fear exactly, but the particular unsteadiness of a person who has spent her whole life in rooms that were too small for her finally stepping into something with no ceiling. Then she saw the man standing at the far end of the platform, and the vertigo shifted into something else entirely. Gideon Mercer was not what she had imagined. She wasn't sure what she had imagined exactly. The letters had given her his character but not his shape, and she realized now that she had somehow pictured someone more like the men her sisters called handsome, which was its own kind of foolishness. Gideon was tall and had the particular leanness of a man who worked outdoors in all weather, with a face that had been arranged by years of sun and wind into something that was not quite severe but was very far from soft. He held his hat in both hands in front of him, which she noticed because it was a nervous gesture, and she hadn't expected him to be nervous. He spotted her before she reached him. She saw him make the calculation. This is her. This is the woman. And she watched his face very carefully for what came after. She had promised herself she would watch for it. The flicker of disappointment. The adjustment that polite people make when reality lands differently than expectation. She didn't see it. What she saw instead was harder to name, something cautious and attentive, like a man trying to read a document in poor light. "Miss Bennet," he said. "Mr. Mercer." She stopped 2 feet from him and didn't extend her hand right away because she wanted to let him set the pace. She'd learned, living with people who needed to feel in control of small things, that letting someone else make the first gesture often told you more about them than anything they said. He extended his hand. His grip was firm without being demonstrative about it. "The train was on time," he said. It was. She looked at him steadily. "You look nervous." He blinked. Then something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the precursor to one, the moment before a face decides whether to commit. "I am nervous." "So am I," she said. "Now we don't have to pretend otherwise." He picked up the heavier of her 2 bags without asking, which she noted. Not because it was gallant, she didn't particularly need gallantry, but because he'd done it without making a production of it. It was just the practical thing, so he'd done it. That told her something. The ride to the ranch took the better part of 2 hours in a wagon that had seen considerable use and showed it honestly. The road was not much of a road by any standard she was accustomed to, and the February cold had a different quality out here. It didn't seep, it pressed, like something with actual weight. She kept her coat closed and didn't complain. Gideon drove and didn't fill the silence with noise, which she appreciated. She'd been filled up with noise her whole life by people who were uncomfortable with quiet. "Lucy," she said after a while. "What about her?" "You said in your letters she doesn't talk much. Is that still true?" "More or less." "Does she know I'm coming?" "I told her." "What did she say?" He was quiet for a moment. "She asked if you were going to move her things." Elena turned that over. "What things?" "She keeps a collection of stones on the windowsill in her room, arranged in a particular order. The woman who came to help last spring, Mrs. Hadley, rearranged them when she cleaned the room. Lucy didn't speak to her for 2 weeks after." "I won't touch her stones," Elena said. "I didn't think you would. I just wanted you to know about them." The ranch appeared in the low gray afternoon light. A main house, 2 long outbuildings, a barn that was larger than it needed to be for any purpose other than the serious raising of cattle, and a scattering of smaller structures that she couldn't identify yet but intended to. Her first impression was not of beauty, but of mass, the sheer accumulated weight of a place that had been built and repaired and expanded and contested over many years. It looked like something that had cost a great deal in ways that money alone couldn't measure. She found out that night that the main house had 5 rooms that were used and 3 that weren't, that the cook stove ran hot on the left side and needed compensating, that the water from the well had a mineral taste she would adjust to or not, and that Lucy Mercer ate her supper with the focused efficiency of a child who had learned not to expect the meal to be pleasant and had decided to simply get through it. Lucy was small for 7, with her father's coloring and an expression of habitual containment that Elena recognized immediately, and with a particular ache, because she had worn the same expression at the same age and for many of the same reasons. She didn't try to engage the girl at dinner. She asked Gideon practical questions about the ranch, the number of hands currently employed, the state of the winter feed stores, when the first spring cattle work would begin, and she ate what was on her plate and helped clear it afterward without being asked. She could feel Lucy watching her from across the table with those careful, assessing eyes. After supper, when Gideon was out checking on something in the barn, Elena sat at the kitchen table with the household ledger Gideon had left in a pile of papers that suggested it hadn't been touched in at least a month. She opened it. She found what she expected: numbers that told a story of a man who was excellent at running cattle and genuinely terrible at keeping track of what that running cost him. There were 3 different systems of notation fighting each other on the same pages, 2 sets of figures that didn't reconcile, and a gap of 5 months where it appeared nobody had recorded anything at all. She was still at the table when Gideon came back in from the cold. He looked at the open ledger and then at her. "I know," he said. "It's all recoverable," she said. "I'll need about a week to sort out where things actually stand. But I can see enough right now to tell you that you're spending money in 2 places you don't need to be, and there's a supplier relationship that someone should renegotiate before spring." He sat down across from her. He looked at the ledger with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Not shame, but something in the neighborhood of it. "Ruth handled all of that," he said. "My first wife. She had a system I never fully understood." Elena waited. "When she left, I just kept doing the spending part and stopped doing the recording part, and after a while the gap got too big to want to look at." "That's how those gaps happen," Elena said, without judgment in her voice, because she genuinely wasn't judging him. She'd seen it before, so capable people who had a hole blown through the routine of their life and simply went around the hole rather than repair it. "I can fix the gap. That's not complicated. What's harder is building a system you'll actually maintain without someone standing over you." "I'll maintain whatever system you put in front of me," he said. "That's not false modesty. I know my limits." She studied him across the table. "That's a rare quality," she said. "Most people know their limits but won't say so out loud." Something moved in his face. The same, almost not quite a smile from the train platform. "You say what you mean." "You asked me to." "I did." He leaned back in his chair. "I wasn't entirely sure you would when it came to it." "Were you disappointed?" she asked. "When you saw me at the station, I want to know." He held her gaze, and she gave him credit for that. A lot of men would have looked away. "No," he said. "Surprised, maybe. The picture I'd built in my head didn't match, but that's not the same thing as disappointed." "What picture had you built?" "Softer," he said after a moment. "I think I expected someone more uncertain of herself." "I am uncertain of myself," Elena said. "I'm just not in the habit of showing it to strangers." She closed the ledger. "I should tell you. I know I'm not what Vivian described in that first letter. Whatever she wrote to catch your attention, I've never tried to be that person. If that's going to be a problem, it's better to say so now." I was quiet for long enough that she felt the first real flutter of something that was not quite fear but was in that direction. Then he said, "The first letter is the reason I wrote back. Every letter after that is the reason I asked you to come." She picked up the ledger and set it straight on the pile. "Then we'll be all right," she said, and she meant it practically, which was the only way she knew how to mean things. But being all right in theory and being all right across 3 months of harsh Wyoming winter were different propositions, and the weeks that followed tested the distinction in ways Elena hadn't fully accounted for. The ranch hands were the first challenge. There were 6 of them, permanent winter staff, and they operated on a well-established social order that had no obvious place for a woman who showed up from back east and immediately started asking pointed questions about where the feed storage money was going. The foreman, a weathered man named Clyde Birch, who had worked for Gideon for 11 years, made his position clear through the specific technique of addressing all his answers to Gideon, even when Elena had been the one to ask the question. She didn't confront him about it. Confrontation was not her first tool. Observation was. She watched Clyde for 2 weeks before she said anything, and what she observed was that he was not a dishonest man or a malicious one. He was a man who had survived by respecting a particular order of things, and she was a disruption to that order, and disruptions made him nervous. She could work with nervous. "Mr. Birch," she said one morning, finding him alone in the tack room. "I've been going through the supply records from the last 2 winters." He kept his eyes on the harness he was mending. "That's so. The losses in the East pasture 2 years ago. The winter that hit the cattle hard. The records show you requested additional feed 3 weeks before it became critical." He stopped mending. His hands went still. "Nobody acted on the request," she continued. "So by the time it was urgent, it was already too late for half of what you were trying to protect." He looked up at her then. Something in his face was wary and also underneath the wariness, surprised. "That's right," he said slowly. "That's not going to happen this year," she said. "I'm tracking the request cycle now. If you make a request in writing and it doesn't get addressed within 4 days, I'll come find out why." She paused. "I'm not interested in finding fault with anyone for what happened before I got here. I'm only interested in not having it happen while I'm here." Clyde Birch looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, the kind of nod that meant more than agreement. It meant recalibration. "Yes, ma'am," he said. After that, he stopped addressing his answers to Gideon when Elena had done the asking. The harder problem was Lucy. Elena had expected difficulty there. She was a practical woman, and she understood that a child who had lost her mother, even to abandonment rather than death, was a child carrying damage that couldn't be fixed by patience alone. What she hadn't expected was the specific shape of Lucy's resistance, which was not hostility, but something more complicated, a kind of watchful waiting, like a small animal that has been hurt by kindness before and is not yet willing to risk it again. Lucy watched her, constantly, from doorways and across rooms, with those two old eyes. But the moment Elena looked directly at her, she disappeared, not running, just withdrawing, pulling back into herself like a tide going out. She ate her meals. She went to the small schoolroom Gideon had set up in the back room with a primer and a strict schedule he didn't always manage to enforce. She kept her stones arranged on the windowsill in their specific order. Elena never touched the stones. She also never pushed. She didn't try to sit with Lucy or engage her in conversation or ask questions designed to draw her out. She understood, from her own experience of being a child who had needed adults to just be present and consistent without demand, that the most useful thing she could do for this girl right now was simply to keep showing up the same way every day, without agenda. What broke the pattern, when it finally broke, was the arithmetic. Elena was working at the kitchen table one evening, reorganizing Gideon's accounting system into something that could be maintained by a person with limited patience for paperwork, which Gideon had described himself as, accurately, when she became aware that Lucy was standing in the doorway, not hiding, just standing. Elena didn't look up. She kept working. After about 2 minutes, Lucy said, "What are you doing?" "Fixing the numbers," Elena said. She still didn't look up. She'd learned with shy animals, and Lucy was something like a shy animal, that eye contact too soon broke the spell. "Are they broken?" "They're not in the right order. Numbers have to be in the right order, or they don't tell you anything useful." Silence. Then the soft sound of bare feet on the wooden floor as Lucy crossed the kitchen and stood beside the table, close enough to see the page. "Those are big numbers," Lucy said. "They are." "Do you know all of them?" "I know how to work with all of them. That's different from knowing them." Elena finally glanced sideways at the girl. Lucy was looking at the ledger with an expression that was the first genuinely unguarded thing Elena had seen on her face. Simple, undefended curiosity. "Do you like numbers?" Lucy thought about it seriously, the way children do when they haven't learned yet to give the expected answer instead of the true one. "I like counting my stones," she said. "I know how many there are without looking." "How many?" 47. No hesitation. "That's a good number to know," Elena said. Lucy stood there a moment longer, then she went back to bed without another word. But the next evening, she appeared in the doorway again, and the evening after that. By the end of the second week, she was sitting at the table while Elena worked, not talking much but present in a way that was entirely different from her earlier watchful distance. She brought one stone with her on the fourth night, a piece of gray quartz with a vein of white running through it, and set it on the table between them without explanation. Elena looked at it. "It's a good one," she said. "I found it by the creek," Lucy said. "Before Mama left." Elena kept her voice level. "Is it your favorite?" "It's the oldest one," Lucy said. "I think it's very old." "Probably," Elena said. "Rocks don't age the way people do. They just keep being rocks." Lucy picked it back up and held it in her palm for a moment, then put it in her pocket and didn't mention her mother again. But something had shifted. Elena could feel it, the way you feel a change in pressure before weather moves in. Not healed, not even close, but slightly more open than before. Gideon noticed. He didn't say much, he was not a man who said much, but one evening in late March, when Lucy had gone to bed and Elena was finishing up the last of a week's accounting work, he came and set a cup of coffee on the table beside her without being asked, which he hadn't done before. She asked me this morning if you were going to stay, he said. Elena looked up. What did you tell her? I told her that was the plan. And? She said good. He sat down across the table the way he had that first night and looked at her with the same direct attention that she had decided by now was simply how he looked at things he was trying to understand accurately. She hasn't said good about anything in 3 years. Elena turned her coffee cup in her hands. She's not fixed, she said. I want to be clear about that. She's just started to feel a little safer. Those are different things. I know the difference. Some people don't. I've had to learn it, he said, and left it at that. The last week of March brought the kind of weather that reminded everyone in Wyoming why the territory weeded out the people who didn't actually want to be there. A late storm came down from the north with the specific savagery of a season refusing to end, driving snow horizontal for 3 days straight, dropping temperatures low enough to threaten the early calving herd. Every hand on the ranch worked through it without sleep in any useful quantity. Elena worked alongside them, not in the barns, where she would have been underfoot in work she didn't know well enough to be useful, but in the house, keeping food moving, keeping the stove running, tracking which animals had been brought in and which were still out, coordinating the information flow between Gideon and his men so that nobody was making decisions based on information that was already 2 hours old. On the second night of the storm, Clyde Birch came in from the cold with a gash on his forearm from a fence wire that had snapped under ice and looked around the kitchen with an expression of naked exhaustion that he would never have let Elena see 3 months ago. She sat him down. She cleaned and bandaged the cut with the medical kit she'd reorganized the first week she arrived. It had been in 4 different places, nothing in it in any logical order, and he sat still and let her do it. You're not what I expected, he said while she worked. What did you expect? Some woman who'd last 6 weeks and go back to wherever she came from. I'm not going back, she said. I can see that. He looked at the bandage when she finished. You do good work, he said. It was not a small thing coming from Clyde Birch. Thank you, she said. Go eat something. By the time the storm broke and the full count came in, livestock losses lower than they'd feared, no men injured beyond the minor, Elena had been awake for the better part of 60 hours. She sat down at the kitchen table at 5 in the morning of the 4th day and put her head on her arms and was asleep in approximately 2 minutes. She woke up because someone had put a blanket over her shoulders. She didn't open her eyes right away. She stayed still and listened to the sounds of the house, the stove, the wind dropping off outside, distant sound of the men starting to move again. And she thought about the blanket on her shoulders, about the specific quiet of someone who had done something careful without wanting to make it into a moment. She thought, this is a person I can build something with, not love. She wasn't ready to name it love. She was too practical for that, and too aware of how much they still didn't know about each other, and too honest to let herself get ahead of what was actually true. But something that had weight to it, the same way the ranch had weight. Not pretty, not simple, but real. She sat up after a while and folded the blanket. Gideon was at the stove, his back to her, making coffee. Thank you, she said. Storm's done, he said, which was not quite an acknowledgement, but was as close as he got. She watched the back of him, the set of his shoulders, the economy of his movements, the way he did things without waste, and thought about what he had said at the beginning, in the kitchen, that first night. I know my limits, he'd said. That's not false modesty. She was beginning to understand that the man who knew his limits was also the man who was absolutely clear about what he valued, and that that combination, in her limited experience, was the rarest kind of person there was. I need to talk to you about the spring contracts, she said, when you have a minute. I have one now, he said, and poured 2 cups of coffee and brought them to the table. She opened the ledger. They sat across from each other in the early morning kitchen with the storm over and the light coming in and talked about cattle contracts and feed prices and the renegotiation she'd been building toward for 6 weeks. And it was nothing like what her sisters would have called romantic. There were no pretty words in it. There was just the serious, focused work of 2 people trying to build something together with what they had available, which was, Elena had come to believe, actually what love looked like when it wasn't performing. She was on the porch that evening, letting the cold air wake her back up, when a ranch hand named Pete, young, barely 20, the newest hire, came out of the bunkhouse and stopped when he saw her. "Evening, Mrs. Mercer," he said. She had been Elena Bennett for 26 years. She had been here 3 months, but she stood on the porch of a house she was beginning to know like she knew her own hands, in a life she had built piece by piece out of letters and honesty and work. And the name didn't feel borrowed. "Evening, Pete," she said. "Get some sleep. We've got a full day tomorrow." He nodded and went back inside. She stayed on the porch a little longer, looking out at the dark expanse of the land, 15,000 acres of it, or so. And every acre of it real in a way her old life had never quite managed to be. And thought about the envelope that had hit her face, and her sister's casual hand, and the train pulling away from a station she hadn't looked back at. What had been meant to humiliate her had carried her here. She had not forgiven her sisters. She wasn't the kind of person who performed forgiveness before she felt it, and she did not feel it yet. But she had stopped being angry in the way that cost her something, and that was different. That was progress. She went inside when the cold got serious. She checked on Lucy, who was asleep with the gray quartz stone on the pillow beside her. She stood in the doorway and looked at the child for a moment. The even breathing, the stillness, the first real sleep of someone who had started to feel, against the odds, that the place they were sleeping was safe. Then she went to her own room and slept the deepest sleep she'd had since the train. She did not know yet what was coming. She did not know about the letter Vivian was already composing 3 states away, choosing every word with the specific skill of a woman who had spent years learning exactly where to press to make something hurt. She did not know about Darius Crow, or the forged records, or the things she would have to do that would change how everyone on the frontier saw her. She knew only what was in front of her, which was enough. It had always been enough. The present, managed well, was the only thing that had ever held. She closed her eyes. Outside, the Wyoming dark settled over 15,000 acres of ground that was, however improbably, however unplanned, hers to help protect. The letter from Vivian arrived on a Wednesday in early May, tucked between a seed catalog and a bill from the hardware supplier in town, and Elena almost didn't recognize the handwriting because Vivian had never written to her before. Not once in 26 years, not a birthday note, not a line. There had been no reason to. You don't write letters to furniture. She stood at the mail table in the front hall and looked at the envelope for a moment before she opened it. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, the kind of careful that meant someone had thought about how it would be received before putting pen to paper. That alone told her more than the words would. She read it standing up. She didn't sit down. She had a policy, developed over years of living with people who used information as weapons, of receiving bad news on her feet so that her first physical response wasn't one of collapse. The letter was 2 pages. It was addressed to Gideon. It had been sent to Elena by mistake, or by design, she couldn't decide which, and with Vivian the distinction was rarely clear. The envelope bore Elena's name, but the letter inside began with "Dear Mr. Mercer," and what followed was the most elegant piece of destruction Elena had ever read, and she gave her sister credit for it even as her hands went cold. Vivian had written to Gideon to inform him, with what she called sisterly duty and deep personal regret, that the woman living in his home was there under false pretenses. That the original letter he had received had been written not by Elena, but by Vivian herself, as a cruel joke, and that Elena had known this from the beginning and had chosen to deceive him anyway. That Elena had a history of manipulating financial accounts in the Bennett household, skimming small amounts over years, and that their father had suspected it but been too ill to address it. That Elena had come to Wyoming not out of any genuine feeling, but because she had identified Mercer Ranch as a financial opportunity and had pursued it with the kind of cold calculation that their family had always found disturbing in her. It ended with, "I am sorry to be the bearer of this truth, but I believe you deserve to know the woman you have taken into your home and what she is truly capable of." Elena read it twice, not because she needed to. She understood it the first time, completely, but because she needed to know exactly what she was dealing with before she decided what to do. Every specific accusation was either a lie or a distortion of truth so thorough that it functioned as a lie. She had not skimmed money. The exact opposite was true. She had stretched money for years past what it should have covered, and if anything had occasionally gone unrecorded, it was because the household system was chaos long before she'd been old enough to manage it, and she'd been doing catch-up accounting for over a decade. She had not known from the beginning that Vivian wrote the first letter. She had suspected it, and then known it, and then chosen to answer as herself anyway, which was either honesty or dishonesty depending on how you arranged the facts, and Vivian had arranged them in the worst possible direction. The thing about a well-constructed lie is that it uses the same raw material as the truth. It just cuts it differently. Elena folded the letter. She put it in the pocket of her apron. She finished what she'd been doing before the mail arrived. She'd been in the middle of drafting a revised contract proposal for the spring cattle sale, and she went back to it and finished the paragraph she'd started because she refused to let Vivian interrupt her work. Then she went and found Gideon. He was in the south barn talking with Clyde about the calving numbers. She waited in the doorway until there was a natural break in the conversation, then asked Clyde to give them a minute. Clyde looked at her face and went without being asked twice. She handed Gideon the letter. She watched him read it. She had positioned herself where she could see his face clearly, not because she needed to manage his reaction, but because she believed that whatever happened next, she wanted to see it honestly, not hear about it secondhand or piece it together from the way he behaved afterward. She had spent too much of her life reconstructing the truth from evidence. If this was going to go badly, she wanted to see it directly. His face didn't do what she expected. She had expected anger. She had prepared for it. The specific kind of anger that comes when a person feels they've been made a fool of, which was a particularly dangerous anger because it had pride underneath it, and wounded pride made people say things they couldn't take back. She had thought through what she would say when he was angry, how she would present her account clearly and without defensiveness, how she would give him room to process without pushing him toward any particular conclusion. What she saw instead was a face going very still. Not the stillness of shock, but the stillness of a man doing careful private work, sorting, weighing, measuring something against something else. He finished the letter. He folded it the same way she had. Then he looked up at her. "Was any of this written to me by mistake?" he said. "Or did she intend you to see it first?" Elena blinked. Of everything she'd expected him to say, that had not been on the list. "I don't know," she said honestly. "It could be either. If she wanted you to see it first, she'd know you'd come to me. She'd be counting on your guilt making you give her version more credit than it deserves when you presented it." Elena stood very still. "Yes," she said. "That's possible. Is any of it true?" "The first letter was written by Vivian. I didn't know that when your reply arrived, but I figured it out quickly and chose to answer as myself anyway. I told you this in my third letter. I said I wanted you to know that whoever had reached out to you first, what you were corresponding with after that, was me." She paused. Everything else she wrote is either entirely fabricated or twisted so far from the original facts that the result is dishonest, even if the raw material isn't. He looked at the folded letter in his hand. "The money," he said. "I kept accounts for a household that was in consistent financial distress. If there are gaps or irregularities in those records, they existed before I was old enough to be responsible for them, and I spent years trying to correct for them. I can produce my own records from the household accounts. I kept a second set, privately, because I learned early on that the official records weren't trustworthy. I have them." She had kept them in her bag. Not for this purpose, or not entirely for this purpose. She'd kept them because she always kept records, because information in documented form was the only kind she'd ever been able to rely on. "That's not what I mean," Gideon said. "I'm not asking you to prove a negative. I'm asking you about the part you already told me was true. The first letter." She met his eyes. "I should have told you earlier than I did. I knew by the second exchange of letters that something was wrong with the origin of the first one, and I didn't say anything until the third. I convinced myself I was waiting for the right moment, but I think I was scared of losing the correspondence before I'd had time to prove it was worth having." She stopped. "That was not honest of me. I've thought about it since, and that's the truth of it." He was quiet for long enough that she heard the calves moving in the pen at the far end of the barn, and a horse shifting its weight somewhere behind her, and the wind against the roof. "My first wife," he said, "never once told me something that was hard for her to say. In 8 years. He set the letter down on the top rail of the nearest stall. Every difficult thing she had to communicate, she found a way to communicate sideways. I didn't understand it for years. I thought that was just how people were." He looked at her steadily. "You walked in here and handed me a letter that could end your life here, without any preamble. And then you told me the one thing in it that was partially true instead of defending everything equally. That's not how a person behaves when they're running a scheme. Elena said nothing, not because she had nothing to say, but because she understood that some moments needed to be allowed to simply land. I'm angry, he said. I want to be clear about that. Not at you, at the situation, and at whoever thought this kind of thing was an acceptable use of their time. He picked the letter back up and looked at it one more time, then folded it again. I'm going to keep this. Not because I don't believe you, because if it ever comes up again, I want the original document in my possession. That's practical, she said. I'm a practical man. He handed the letter back to her. Put it with your records. Yours should stay together. She took it. Her hands were steadier than she felt, which was a skill she'd developed early and maintained out of sheer necessity. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner, she said, about the letter. I know you are. He picked up the clipboard he'd set down when she came in. I've got calving numbers to finish reviewing with Clyde. Come find me for supper. She walked back to the house in the May afternoon with the letter in her apron pocket and the particular lightness of someone who had braced for impact and found the ground less hard than expected. Not soft. Nothing about Gideon Mercer was soft, but the ground had held. She had not known, until this moment, how much she had needed it to hold. The peace that followed lasted exactly 19 days. She knew this precisely because she had noted the date of Vivian's letter in her records, and she was already noting the date of Darius Crow's first visit when she realized the two events were going to be connected in ways that would take her much longer to untangle than a single afternoon. She'd heard of Crow before she saw him. His name came up the way weather came up, as a condition of the landscape you planned around whether you liked it or not. He owned the adjacent territory to the north and east, more acreage than Mercer Ranch, with different cattle and different methods, and the specific confidence of a man who had never lost anything significant and had therefore never been required to reconsider his judgment. He was in his mid-50s, broad through the chest, with a face that had arranged itself over time into an expression of permanent assurance. He rode with two other men always, which Elena noted from the kitchen window the first time he came to call, because men who kept company as a constant chose it either for safety or for audience, and she couldn't yet tell which applied to Crow. The visit was social on the surface. He sat in the front room and drank coffee and said polite things about the recovery of the ranch from the winter storm, and asked after the calving numbers with the air of a man who was gathering information while performing conversation. Elena poured the coffee and stayed in the room. She had gotten past the point of absenting herself from rooms where important things were being discussed, and Gideon had stopped expecting her to. Crow barely looked at her, not in the way men sometimes didn't look at women. The dismissal of it, the social habit of aiming conversation at whoever they decided was the authority in the room. This was different. He looked at Gideon exclusively with the specific deliberateness of a man who had made a prior decision not to acknowledge someone. Elena noticed it the way she noticed everything that didn't fit the expected pattern, which was to say immediately and with careful attention. Fine operation you've got running again, Crow said. Was worried about you after Ruth left. Worried the place might not survive the transition. He glanced around the room with an expression of benevolent appraisal. Seems you found your footing. We did, Gideon said. The we was small and deliberate, and Crow acknowledged it by continuing not to look at Elena. He left after 40 minutes, and the two men he rode with were standing at the horses when Elena came to the window. One of them was looking at the boundary fence line to the east, with an attention that struck her as too focused for casual. She watched him for a full minute. He wasn't admiring the land, he was measuring it. She filed this away without saying anything yet, because she had learned, from years of managing situations in a household where information was power, that you spoke when you had enough of it to matter and not before. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived from the Territorial Land Office. Gideon read it at breakfast, and his face did something Elena had not seen it do. It went genuinely uncertain, which was different from careful and different from still, and it alarmed her more than either of those things would have. He handed her the letter. She read it. Darius Crow had filed a legal challenge to the eastern boundary of Mercer Ranch, claiming that a survey error made over a decade ago had placed the boundary line incorrectly, and that approximately 2,000 acres of what Mercer Ranch used as prime grazing territory actually fell within the boundaries of Crow's land grant, as established by the original government survey. He was asking the territorial court to review the original documentation and correct the record, 2,000 acres of the eastern pasture. Elena knew exactly which land that was. She had been over the whole ranch by now, not out of romance, but out of the same systematic need to know the things she was working with that had led her to reorganize the medical kit in her first week and the accounting system in her second. The eastern pasture was the best grazing land on the property. Losing it wouldn't just cost acreage, it would restructure what the ranch was economically capable of doing. When did Crow file this? She said. 3 weeks ago, according to the letter. We're just now receiving notice. 3 weeks. She set the letter down. She thought about the man at the horses, measuring the fence line. He came to visit 4 weeks ago. Gideon looked at her. The man with him. The one who stayed by the horses while Crow was inside. He was looking at the eastern fence line. I noticed it. He was quiet for a moment. You think he was already planning this when he visited? I think it's worth knowing when he filed the paperwork relative to when he came here, she said. Can we find that out? We can ask the court. Then let's do that first, before anything else. She picked the letter back up. We need to pull every original land document you have, survey records, the original grant, anything that establishes the boundary. Where are those kept? The ranch office. There are boxes in the back room. I need access to all of them. He looked at her across the breakfast table with that same measuring quality he'd had on the train platform, trying to read something in poor light, giving it his full attention. You understand land law? He said. No, she said. I understand documents. Those are different things, but one of them is actually more useful right now. The lawyer Gideon brought in from Cheyenne was a man named Aldous Fitch, competent and cautious, with the specific fatalism of a territorial lawyer who had seen enough land disputes to know how rarely they resolved in favor of the smaller party. He came out to the ranch in the second week of June, reviewed the filing, and gave Gideon an assessment that he clearly believed was honest and that Elena quietly found insufficient. The challenge hinges on an 1871 survey, Fitch said, spreading documents across the kitchen table. If Crow's version of that survey establishes his boundary line where he's claiming, the court's going to have to weigh it against Mercer's 1874 grant documentation. The problem is that the 1871 survey has been on file with the Territorial Office for over a decade without challenge. Judges give weight to documents with long histories. What's the basis of his survey claim? Elena said. Fitch looked at her the way men in professional contexts often looked at her. A brief recalibration, the adjustment from addressing the principal to acknowledging that there was a second person in the room with relevant things to say. He has a copy of what he's presenting as the original 1871 survey, signed by a licensed surveyor named Elias Brandt. Do you have a copy of it? She said. He slid it across the table. She looked at it. Then she read it again, more slowly. Is there something wrong with it? Gideon said. He was watching her face the same way he'd watched it the morning she'd handed him Vivian's letter. I don't know yet, she said. I need to look at something. Can I keep this copy? Fitch hesitated. That's the court's document. Then I need to get to a place where I can look at the original. She put the copy down. When is the hearing? 6 weeks. 6 weeks was not enough time and was also going to have to be enough time, which was a condition Elena had been working under her entire adult life. She started in the ranch office the next morning. The back room had boxes that hadn't been opened since before Ruth left, and some of them, going by the dust, hadn't been opened since before that. Elena went through them in the order they'd been stacked, not the order that felt most promising, because the order that felt most promising was the order in which you'd assume things, and she couldn't afford assumptions. She cataloged everything she found, dates, document types, names, signatures, in a new log she kept separate from the main accounting records. It took 4 days to work through the boxes. She did it while maintaining the rest of her daily work because the ranch didn't stop needing management while she was researching, and she had never been a person who used one pressing thing as an excuse to neglect everything else. On the 5th day, she sat down with the copy of Crow's survey and her own log and began comparing. Gideon checked on her 3 times that first day. She'd set up at the large table in the office with documents spread in a careful system that she understood and that probably looked from the outside like organized chaos. He brought her food at midday without being asked and left it without interrupting her, which was one of the things she'd come to understand as a defining quality in him. He was capable of making space for someone else's work without needing to insert himself into it. Are you finding anything? he said, the third time, in the evening. I don't know yet, she said. I know what I'm looking for. I don't know if it's here. What are you looking for? A mistake, she said. Not a mistake in our records, a mistake in his. He sat down on the edge of the desk. Fitch doesn't think we have much of a case. Fitch is measuring the case we have. I'm trying to change the case we have. She didn't look up from the documents. There's a difference. He was quiet for a moment. What if there's no mistake to find? Then we'll know that too, and we'll fight with what we have. She did look up then. But I don't think that's what's going to happen. A man who files a legal claim on land that has been clearly operated as someone else's for over a decade isn't doing it because he has a clean document. He's doing it because he has a document he believes won't be examined closely enough. She saw something settle in Gideon's face. Not confidence exactly. He was too careful for easy confidence, but something that was the near neighbor of it. I'm going to trust your judgment on this, he said. I know, she said. That helps. She went back to work, and he went to bed, and she worked until 2 in the morning when the lamp needed more oil than she had on hand, at which point she stopped. Not because she wanted to, but because she couldn't see the documents anymore without adequate light, and a mistake made under inadequate light cost more time than the rest gained. She lay in bed for an hour not sleeping and thought about what she had and what she hadn't found yet. There was something in the dating of Crow's survey that sat wrong with her. She had looked at it so many times now that she almost couldn't see it anymore, the way a word stops looking like a word when you write it too many times in a row. She needed to come back to it with fresh eyes. She was back at the table before dawn. It was on the 3rd morning of the 2nd week, 12 days in total, when she found it. She had been cross-referencing the surveyor's credentials. Not the survey itself, she'd been through the survey so many times she could recite it, but the man who'd signed it. Elias Brandt, licensed surveyor. She had the name, she had the signature, she had the date. The date on the survey was June 14, 1871. And then, in a box of territorial administrative records that Gideon had never opened because they'd been sent to him as property tax documentation. And tax documentation was the kind of thing people set aside and didn't look at again. In that box, tucked between 2 years of property assessments, she found a printed list of licensed surveyors in the territory, issued by the land office. It was dated 1872. It was a complete register of all licensed surveyors as of that year, with their licensing dates. Elias Brandt's licensing date was March 1872. Elena sat very still. The survey was dated June 1871. 9 months before the man who had supposedly conducted it was licensed to conduct surveys in the territory. 9 months before Elias Brandt had the legal authority to sign any survey document whatsoever. She looked at it again. She looked at the licensing list again. She looked at the date on Crow's survey again. Then she got up very carefully, as if sudden movement might cause the thing she'd found to rearrange itself into something less significant, and went to find Gideon. He was at breakfast with Lucy. Lucy was eating her oatmeal and organizing the spoon and the cup on the table in a precise geometric relationship to each other, which was a new behavior that Elena had noticed and privately found charming. She stood in the doorway until Gideon looked up. He saw her face and put his cup down. I need you to come look at something, she said. Lucy looked up too. She had gotten good at reading rooms. Is it important? She said. Yes, Elena said. Okay, Lucy said, and went back to her oatmeal with the equanimity of a child who had decided that important things, when handled by Elena, generally turned out all right. In the office, Elena laid the licensing list and the survey copies side by side on the table and pointed. She didn't say anything. She let him read it himself. She watched him read it. She watched the moment he understood what he was looking at, which was visible as a very small change in his posture, a slight forward shift, a stilling. The survey's dated before he was licensed, Gideon said, 9 months before. So either he conducted the survey before he had legal standing to conduct surveys, which makes the document invalid on its own, Gideon said slowly, or someone created a document and dated it before the license existed because they didn't know to check when the license was issued. The second one, Elena said. The first would be an irregularity that could potentially be argued around. The second one is fraud. It's not a mistake. A licensed surveyor would know his own licensing date. Someone created a document with his name on it and got the timeline wrong. She watched Gideon's jaw tighten, not anger that went wide and loud, the other kind, the kind that went inward and then hard. Crow, he said, or someone working for him who he may or may not have known the specifics of. Either way, the document isn't valid. Fitch needs to see this today. I'll write up a summary of the complete documentation chain so he has everything he needs to present it clearly, she said. She was already thinking about the summary, the exact structure of it. I need a day. You have it. He picked up the licensing list and looked at it one more time. Then he set it down precisely. Elena. She looked up from the table. I don't know where we'd be right now if you hadn't… He stopped, started again. I'm not good at saying things like this. I know, she said. I'm working on it. I know that too. She pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward her. Go tell Clyde we need a rider to Cheyenne the day after tomorrow. He went. She sat at the table in the morning light with Elias Brandt's licensing date and Darius Crow's fraudulent survey and the particular quiet satisfaction of a person who had looked at something long enough and carefully enough to see what everyone else had missed, and she began to write. She wrote for most of that day. She organized the documentation chain in precise sequence, not just the single point of the licensing date, but everything surrounding it that would make the inconsistency impossible to overlook or argue past. She cited each document by box number and content as she had cataloged it. She cross-referenced the survey's other internal dates against the verified record. She wrote it in the plain language she used for everything, without ornament, because plain language was harder to misconstrue than elaborate language, and she wanted there to be nothing in this document that could be misconstrued. Clyde knocked on the office door at midday and handed her a cup of coffee without comment. She thanked him without looking up. She was aware, in the background of her concentration, of the sounds of the ranch going through its afternoon work outside. The hands moving between the barn and the outbuildings, Lucy's voice somewhere in the yard asking Pete about something, the particular creak of the main gate. Her life, doing what it did, while she worked to protect it. By the time the summary was finished, it was nearly supper time. She read through it once, made 3 small corrections for precision, and set it aside to be carried to Cheyenne. Fitch's response came back in 4 days. It was the first letter from Aldous Fitch that did not contain the word, unfortunately. He had taken the licensing documentation to the court clerk's office and verified it against the official territorial records. The discrepancy was confirmed. He was filing an emergency motion to submit the new evidence and requesting that the hearing be postponed 30 days to allow time to develop the full fraud argument. He was also, he added in the final paragraph, requesting that whoever had compiled the documentation summary present themselves to consult directly, as it was the most precisely constructed evidentiary brief he had reviewed in 22 years of territorial law practice. Gideon read that paragraph and then read it again. Then he handed the letter to Elena without comment, but with the expression that had replaced the almost not quite a smile by now, the real one, infrequent and unperformed and therefore worth considerably more than the frequent kind. She read Fitch's paragraph. She felt something she didn't have an exact name for. Not pride exactly, not satisfaction exactly, but the specific quality of being seen accurately for what you were and what you had done, by someone qualified to recognize it. He wants to meet with me, she said. Yes. I'm going to need 2 days in Cheyenne. I know. I'll go with you. He paused. If you want company. She thought about it. She thought about standing in a lawyer's office and having someone standing beside her, not because she needed to lean on them, but because they had chosen, without her asking, to be present for the important things. Yes, she said. I'd like that. They went to Cheyenne the following week, the 3 of them, because Lucy, when she heard they were going, said with the particular firmness of a 7-year-old who has decided something, that she wanted to come too, and Elena had looked at Gideon, and Gideon had looked at Elena, and Lucy had stood between them with her gray quartz stone in her fist, and nobody had said no. The hearing, when it came, lasted 1 afternoon. Fitch presented the licensing discrepancy with the methodical pleasure of a man who had not had a case this clean in some time. Crow's lawyer attempted 3 different approaches to arguing around it. An error in the registry, a clerical misdating, a question of the licensing list's own validity. And Fitch demolished each one with documentation that Elena had included in her summary specifically because she had anticipated those 3 arguments and had preloaded the counter-evidence. The judge was a spare, humorless man named Hartwell, who had been on the territorial bench for 15 years and who had seen enough land fraud to recognize it without requiring it to be explained to him more than once. He read through the documentation chain during a brief recess. When court resumed, he made his ruling in 2 sentences. The survey submitted by Darius Crowe was not a valid legal document. The boundary of Mercer Ranch, as established by the 1874 land grant, stood. Crowe, across the courtroom, went very still in the particular way of a man who had expected to win and had not. He looked across the room, not at Gideon, at Elena. She met his eyes steadily and then looked away, because she had no interest in the theater of it. She had done the work. The outcome was the work's consequence. She didn't need the moment of triumph over another person's face. She had never been built for that kind of satisfaction. Fitch was shaking Gideon's hand. Gideon turned to her. Lucy, who had been sitting beside Elena through the whole afternoon with her stone in her pocket and her eyes moving between the judge and Elena and back, tugged Elena's sleeve. Elena looked down. "Did we win?" Lucy said. "Yes," Elena said. "We won." Lucy nodded once, with the gravity of someone confirming a fact she had already suspected. Then she slipped her hand into Elena's and held it, and Elena looked down at the small fingers wrapped around hers and felt something move through her chest that she had no intention of examining in a courtroom in Cheyenne with Aldous Fitch talking about next steps, and Gideon beside her and Darius Crowe's lawyer gathering papers across the room. She would examine it later. In private, the way she examined all the things that mattered most to her. For now she held Lucy's hand and stood straight and let Fitch finish his sentence, and that was enough. Lucy didn't let go of Elena's hand until they were back at the wagon, and even then it was a gradual release, the fingers loosening one at a time, the way a person wakes from sleep slowly, in stages. Nobody remarked on it. Gideon lifted Lucy up to the wagon seat and Elena climbed up on the other side, and Fitch stood on the boardwalk saying something about follow-up documentation that Elena was hearing without fully processing, because she was still feeling the exact weight of those small fingers in her hand, and trying to put that feeling somewhere it wouldn't interfere with the rest of the afternoon. The ride back to the ranch from Cheyenne took most of the day. Lucy fell asleep against Elena's arm somewhere in the second hour, her stone still in her fist, and Elena sat without moving so as not to wake her, which meant her left arm went numb from the elbow down, sometime around the third hour, and she didn't do anything about that either. Gideon glanced over once and saw the situation and said nothing, but there was something in his expression that she had come to recognize over the preceding months, the look of a man quietly revising his understanding of something important. They were back at the ranch by evening. Pete took the horses. Lucy woke up disoriented and allowed herself to be carried inside by Gideon in the boneless way of children who are not fully conscious, which was the only time she allowed herself to be carried because, awake, she had her dignity to maintain. Elena went to the kitchen and started supper by reflex, not because she needed the action, but because her hands needed something to do while her mind finished processing the day. She was at the stove when Gideon came back in from putting Lucy to bed. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. Then he said, "Fitch is going to recommend you to every rancher in Powder River County who has a document problem." "That's Fitch's prerogative," she said. "Is it something you'd want? The work?" She thought about it honestly, the way she did most things. "I don't know yet. Ask me in 6 months." She turned to look at him. "How are you feeling about today?" He considered the question with the seriousness he gave to most questions, which was one of the things she had come to value most about him. He didn't produce quick answers to cover the space where a real one hadn't arrived yet. "Relieved," he said after a moment, "and angry, still, that it was necessary. That's a reasonable combination. Crowe's not going to forgive this." "No," she agreed. "He isn't." She turned back to the stove. "But he's also not going to try the same thing twice. He'll know now that the documents here get examined. Because of you." "Because of us," she said. "You kept those records. I just read them." He came into the kitchen fully then, not to help. He was not a man who involved himself in cooking as a rule, but to sit at the table, which was what he did when he wanted to be in the same room without being in the way. She found she didn't mind it. She had grown up in a household full of people and had always felt alone in it, and now she was often literally alone on a ranch with vast empty land on all sides and almost never felt that way. And she understood that the difference was this man at the table, reading a week-old newspaper without demanding anything from her presence, except that she continue to be there. Aldous Fitch called you the most precise legal mind he'd encountered in 22 years of practice, Gideon said, not looking up from the paper. He called my summary precise. That's different. Is it? A precise summary requires organized thinking. It doesn't require legal training or the kind of knowledge that comes from 20 years of practice. She paused. He was being generous. He was being accurate, Gideon said, and turned the page. She let that sit without argument, which was its own kind of concession. What happened in the weeks after the hearing was not what Elena expected, which was to say she had not expected anything particularly dramatic, and the territory surprised her. Word traveled the way. Word travels in places where people are spread thin across large distances, faster and more completely than the infrastructure should have allowed. By the end of July, 3 different ranching families had asked Gideon whether his wife would be willing to look at their land documents. One of them came in person, a woman named Margaret Hale, whose husband had died the previous winter, and who was facing a creditor dispute over their grazing lease, and who sat at Elena's kitchen table with her own bundle of papers and a composure that Elena recognized as the kind built over years of not letting people see when you were frightened. Elena looked at Margaret Hale's documents. She found 2 errors in the creditor's accounting that reduced the contested amount by nearly a third, and a clause in the original lease that the creditor had been consistently misapplying. She wrote it all out in the same plain, systematic way she wrote everything. Margaret Hale looked at the written summary and then looked at Elena with an expression that was difficult to read, something between relief and a more complicated feeling that Elena understood was about more than the documents. "How much do I owe you?" Margaret said. "Nothing," Elena said. "That's not right." "It's what I'm asking for." "Then I'll bring food," Margaret said. "I make better preserves than anyone in this county, and I'll fight anyone who says otherwise." Elena almost smiled. "That's acceptable." Margaret left with her summary and came back 2 weeks later with 6 jars of apricot preserves and a peach butter that Gideon declared was the finest thing he'd eaten in a decade, which was high praise from a man who rarely used the word finest about anything. But what Margaret Hale also brought, incidentally, was her neighbor, a rancher named Dolph Sutter, who had a grazing rights dispute of his own and had heard, from Margaret, that the woman at Mercer Ranch was worth talking to. Elena helped Dolph Sutter. Then she helped the family he referred. Then she helped the family after that. She didn't build a business from it, not formally. That would have required a kind of structure and legal standing she neither had nor was certain she wanted. What she built instead was something more like a reputation, which in a territory the size of Wyoming was in many ways more useful than formal credentials. People knew that if you brought your documents to Elena Mercer, you would get an honest reading and a clear summary and no wasted time, and if there was something wrong in what you'd been given, she would find it. Gideon watched all of this with what she had come to understand was his specific form of pride, not the demonstrative kind that required an audience, but the kind that sat quietly inside him and informed how he talked about her to other people when she wasn't in the room. She knew about this because Clyde Birch mentioned it once, offhandedly, in the way that people mention things they don't realize are significant. "The boss tells everyone who asks that the ranch wouldn't have survived the crow situation without you," Clyde said. They were in the supply room going over the fall inventory, which was a task Elena had taken over entirely because Clyde's system, while effective for the information he personally needed, produced records that no one else could interpret. "That's generous," Elena said. "It's not generous, ma'am. It's what he says." Clyde handed her the tally sheet. "He also says it wasn't just the crow thing. He says you're the reason the operation runs the way it does now." Elena wrote a number in the log. "You keep the operation running, Mr. Birch. You and the men." "We do the cattle work," Clyde said. "You make sure the cattle work is worth doing." He said it without sentiment, the way he said things he'd simply concluded were accurate. "Those aren't the same thing." She didn't answer him, but she thought about what he'd said for the rest of the afternoon. It was a Thursday in late September when the second letter arrived from back east. Not from Vivian this time. From her father. Or rather, from her father's solicitor, a man named Griggs, writing on behalf of the Bennett family to inform Elena that her father's accumulated debts had reached a crisis point, that the house and its contents were at risk of legal seizure, and that the family was in urgent need of assistance from any quarter available to them. The letter was formal and careful, and had the specific quality of legal language written by someone who had been instructed to make an unpleasant request sound as reasonable as possible. Elena read it at the kitchen table, alone, before anyone else was awake. She'd been up early, she was usually up early, working on the fall accounting, and the mail from the previous day had been sitting in a stack she hadn't gotten to. She put the letter down. She looked at the wall. She thought about her father, who was not a cruel man but was a weak one, which was in some ways worse than cruelty because cruelty had a consistent logic to it that weakness didn't. She thought about her mother, who had navigated the household's failures by refusing to look directly at them. She thought about Rosalind and Clara, who were not bad people but had grown up in an environment where not being bad was considered sufficient. She thought about Vivian, who was the one she had to sit with longest because Vivian was the most complicated, a woman of genuine intelligence and capability who had directed all of it, for as long as Elena could remember, toward tearing down rather than building. She thought about the letter Vin had written to Gideon. She thought about the hand moving fast across the face and the envelope hitting her cheekbone and the sound of laughter that didn't need to be loud to cut. And then she thought about Lucy sleeping upstairs with her stone, and Gideon who said what he meant and meant what he said, and the 6 jars of apricot preserves from Margaret Hale, and Clyde Birch saying those aren't the same thing in the supply room, like it was simply a fact he'd taken the time to establish. She thought about all of it for a long time. Then she got up and made coffee and went back to the fall accounting, and she did not make any decision about the letter until she'd had time to think it through from every direction, because she had learned, over the course of a life that required her to make decisions before she was ready, that the decisions she made calmly and completely were always better than the ones she made fast. She told Gideon about the letter that evening, after supper, after Lucy was in bed. She handed it to him the same way she'd handed him Vivian's letter, directly, without preamble, because she had no system for managing information other than the direct one. He read it. He handed it back. "What do you want to do?" he said. "I don't know yet," she said. "I'm still thinking." "All right." She looked at him. "You're not going to tell me what to do?" "It's your family. It involves money, potentially significant money. You manage the finances here. You know what we have and what we can move." He picked up his coffee cup. "What I think doesn't change what you want to do. It might inform it." He set the cup down. He thought about it the way he thought about most things, thoroughly, without rushing. "I think you've spent your whole life being told you're less than you are by people who needed you to be less so they could feel like more. And now some of those people need something from you. So the question isn't really about the money." He paused. "The question is what kind of person you want to be when someone who hurt you needs help. And that's not a question I can answer for you." She was quiet for a moment. "Do you think I should help them?" "I think you'll help them," he said, "because that's who you are. The more interesting question is what you ask for in return." She looked at him across the table. "That's very direct. You said once that you appreciated directness." "I do." She thought about it. "I'm not going to ask for an apology. Apologies can be performed. I've watched Vivian perform them my entire life." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "I want something real, something that costs them something." "What costs them something?" "The truth," she said, having to say it out loud. "Not to me. I don't need to hear it from them, but to themselves and to each other." She straightened the edge of the letter against the table. "I'll help them, but I want them to come here." Gideon raised an eyebrow, just slightly. "Here. To the ranch. I want them to see this. I want them to see what I built, what we built. Not because I need them to be impressed, but because I think seeing it is the only thing that might actually shift something in how they think. They have a fixed idea of me that they've been maintaining for 30 years. That fixed idea needs a physical object they can't ignore." She paused. "Does that make sense?" "More sense than they deserve," he said. "But yes." She wrote back to Griggs, the solicitor, 3 days later. She did not write to her family directly because she understood the leverage in working through the formal channel. It made the response feel more significant, gave it the weight of something considered rather than reactive. She agreed to help with the debts, subject to a full accounting of what was actually owed and what assets remained, which she requested be sent to her before any commitment was finalized. She indicated that she would expect the family to travel to Wyoming so that the arrangement could be discussed in person. She wrote it all in the same plain language she used for everything, with no cruelty in it, and also no softening, just the terms. The accounting arrived in November. She went through it in 2 evenings and found what she expected. The debts were serious but not unsurvivable with proper restructuring, and the family's picture of their situation was several $1,000s more catastrophic than the actual numbers required it to be, which was a common feature of financial distress. The emotional weight of debt expanded it beyond its real dimensions, and the expansion made it feel impossible to address, which made people stop looking at the numbers, which made the numbers worse. She wrote up a restructuring proposal. She could cover the most pressing debts from the ranch's operating surplus without materially affecting their spring capacity. She had been running the accounts conservatively all year with exactly this kind of contingency in mind, not because she had anticipated this particular situation, but because building margin into financial management was simply what she did. The remaining debts could be managed on a repayment schedule with the creditors if approached correctly, which she knew how to do. She wrote the proposal. She did not send it yet. The Bennett family arrived in Wyoming in the second week of December, 2 weeks before the year turned, in the kind of cold that made the air feel sharp at the edges. Vivian, Rosalind, Clara, and their mother. Their father was too ill to travel, which was Griggs the solicitor's addendum to their reply, and which Elena received with the specific complexity of a person who has complicated feelings about someone they have already, in some interior way, begun the long work of grieving. She did not go to the station to meet them. She sent Pete with the wagon and stayed at the ranch. Not as a power gesture, she had no interest in power gestures, but because she needed to be on her own ground when she saw them, in the environment she'd built, not on neutral territory where the encounter had no context. She heard the wagon coming up the road from the kitchen window. She was at the stove, not because she needed to appear domestic, but because it was the hour she started supper, and she was not going to rearrange her day around their arrival. She had considered that instinct carefully and decided it was honest rather than petty. Gideon was in the front room. Lucy was upstairs. Elena had told Lucy that some of her family from back east were coming to visit, and Lucy had said, "The ones who sent you here as a joke?" And Elena had stopped and looked at the girl and said, "Where did you hear that?" And Lucy had said, "Papa told me when I asked him once." And Elena had sat with that for a moment. The fact that Gideon had told Lucy, the fact that Lucy had held the information privately until now, the fact that the child had a clearer sense of the story than most adults gave her credit for. "Yes," Elena had said. "Those ones." Lucy had thought about it. "Are you scared to see them?" she'd asked. "No," Elena had said, and then, because Lucy deserved the honest version, "A little, but mostly no." Lucy had nodded. "I'll be upstairs," she'd said, which was her way of saying, "I'll be available if you need me," expressed in the language of a 7-year-old who had spent her short life learning how to offer support without making demands. Elena heard the front door. She heard Pete's voice, and then Gideon's, and then the particular sound of people entering an unfamiliar space, the slight hesitation of movement, the unconscious quiet that comes over people when they don't know the rules of a place yet. She waited until she heard the sound settle, which took about 3 minutes. Then she took the pot off the heat and went to the front room. They were standing rather than sitting, which meant Gideon hadn't gotten to the sitting down stage of the welcome, which meant the situation was more uncomfortable than normal. Vivian was at the far side of the room, looking at the room itself with an expression that Elena recognized as her sister's default response to environments she hadn't expected. A rapid assessment, a recalibration she was trying to make look like casual interest. Rosalind was beside her, quieter, more contained. Clara looked genuinely cold and a little overwhelmed. Their mother was holding her coat closed with both hands and looking at Elena with an expression that was the most honest thing on any of their faces, something that mixed relief with a guilt that she clearly didn't know what to do with. Elena looked at all 4 of them. She let herself look. She gave herself the moment of simply standing in the doorway of the home she had built and looking at the people who had watched her become invisible for 30 years and feeling the difference between who she had been in that other life and who she was standing here now. Then she said, "Supper's in an hour. I'll show you where to wash up." Vivian opened her mouth and then closed it. She had clearly prepared for a different opening. The first evening was the most difficult, not explosive. Elena had not expected explosion and had not gotten it. What she got instead was the particular tension of people who have a great deal to say to each other and are negotiating, in real time, which things to say first. Supper was eaten with a degree of care that was its own kind of exhaustion. Gideon was present and polite without being warm, which was exactly the right calibration. She hadn't asked him to be cold to them, but she hadn't asked him to make it easy for them either, and he understood the distinction without being told. Lucy came down for supper. She sat next to Elena, as she had gotten into the habit of doing, and ate her meal and looked at the Bennett women with those measuring eyes, and said almost nothing, which was not unusual for Lucy in a room full of strangers. Clara, who was the youngest and the least armored, said to Lucy, "How old are you?" 7, Lucy said. "Do you like it here? On the ranch?" Lucy considered her. "I like it better than before," she said. Clara looked at Elena, then back at Lucy. "Before what?" "Before Mama came," Lucy said, and went back to her meal with the completeness of someone who had said the true thing and didn't see any reason to elaborate. The silence that followed had weight to it. Elena felt Vivian look at her across the table and did not look back. It was the next morning, in the ranch office, that the real conversation happened. Elena had arranged it this way deliberately. She had let the evening pass without the discussion, knowing that a night in an unfamiliar place, in an unfamiliar quiet, would do work she couldn't do herself. Vivian, she knew, was a different person in the morning than in the evening. The performance cost something, and it cost more as the night went on, and morning caught her before she'd fully rebuilt it. She brought Vivian to the office alone. She put the restructuring proposal on the table between them and sat down and looked at her sister. Vivian was 41. She had always been beautiful, and she was still beautiful, though the particular sharpness of her face had set differently than it used to. She looked at the proposal without touching it. "You've already worked it out," she said. "Yes." "Of course you have." There was something in her voice that was not quite bitterness and not quite admiration, something that had nowhere to go. "The debts are manageable," Elena said. "I can cover the immediate crisis from here without serious strain. The rest can be structured. It will take 18 months to 2 years to fully clear if your mother manages the remaining household expenses the way I've indicated in the proposal. That's on the back pages." Vivian still didn't touch the proposal. She looked at the room instead. The shelves of document boxes, each one labeled in Elena's handwriting, the ledgers in their precise sequence, the licensed survey records from the Crow dispute that Elena still kept here rather than in storage because she preferred to have them where she could access them. "You built all this," Vivian said. "Not a question. Something else." "We built it," Elena said. "Gideon and I and every person who works here. You know what I mean." "I do." Elena looked at her steadily. "Say what you mean, Vivian." Vivian's jaw tightened. I don't know what I expected. Something smaller, something that made more sense." She looked at Elena directly for the first time since she'd arrived. "I didn't come here to apologize because I'm not sure I know how to do that in a way that would mean anything. I've been trying to figure out what to say to you since we got on the train, and I haven't found it yet." "I'm not asking for an apology," Elena said. "Then what are you asking for?" "I'm asking you to help your mother manage the household finances for the next 2 years the way I've laid out in that proposal. And I'm asking you to stop telling the story of how I came to be here as a joke." She paused. "Not for my sake. It stopped mattering to me what people back east think a long time ago. For your own sake. Because that story makes you the villain of it. And you're not entirely a villain, Vivian. You're someone who made a cruel choice and has been carrying it in a way that's made you smaller than you could be." Vivian was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Elena heard the sounds of the ranch outside. The men moving, the cattle in the far pen, the particular morning quality of the cold. "You were always like this," Vivian said finally. Her voice was different now, stripped of something. "Even when we were children, you just saw things, and nobody wanted to know that you saw them." "I know," Elena said. "I don't know if that makes what I did better or worse." "It doesn't make it either. It just makes it what it was." Elena put her hand flat on the proposal. "Take this. Read it tonight. If there's anything in it you don't understand, come back and ask me." Vivian picked up the proposal. She looked at it for a moment. The neat handwriting, the organized sections, the characteristic plainness of it. and Elena watched something move across her sister's face that she had no name for and didn't try to name. "Lucy called you Mama," Vivian said. "Yes. At supper. She said Mama came, and I didn't know if I'd heard right." "She started saying it about a month ago," Elena said. "I didn't ask her to." Vivian held the proposal for another moment. Then she stood up, which was how she ended conversations she didn't know how to finish. "I'll read it tonight," she said. She left. Elena stayed in the office for a few minutes after she went, not because she needed to collect herself exactly, but because she wanted to sit in the room for a moment and let things settle. She thought about the envelope hitting her face. She thought about this particular casualness of Vivian's hand. She thought about the train platform in Cheyenne and Gideon saying, "I know my limits. That's not false modesty." She thought about Lucy's stone on the pillow and 47 counted without looking, and the blanket someone had put over her shoulders without making it a moment. She was not done with the work of forgiving her sister. She was not sure she would ever be entirely done with it. Forgiveness, in her experience, was not a single act but a long and imperfect project, like the accounts. Something you returned to, corrected, reconciled, and returned to again. You didn't finish it. You just got better at it over time. What she had today was not forgiveness, but it was something. It was the possibility of it. And she had learned, over the course of a year that had tested her in almost every direction she could think of, that possibility was a reasonable place to start. She opened the fall accounting log. She picked up her pen. Outside, the ranch moved through its morning in the way it always did. Methodically, without sentimentality, doing what needed doing because the land required it. She went back to work. Rosalind came to the office that afternoon, which Elena had not expected. Rosalind sat down across the table without being invited, which was her characteristic habit. She had always moved through spaces as if she'd already been there. "Vivian says the proposal is solid," she said. Vivian read the whole thing already. Vivian reads fast when it's in her interest to. Rosalind looked around the office with the assessing quality she'd always had, but it was a different quality here than it had been back home, because here the assessment didn't seem to find anything to discount. "She also said you told her she wasn't entirely a villain." "I said what I thought was true." "You always did." Rosalind's mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile. "We hated that about you. Did you know that? We used to say it to each other, that you were too honest, that it was irritating." She looked at the shelves again. "It wasn't irritating. We didn't like being seen by you because you saw things that weren't flattering." "I never said any of it out loud," Elena said. "You didn't have to." Rosalind put her hands in her lap. "I'm not going to try to explain away what we did to you. I've been thinking about what I could say since we got on the train, same as Vivian. The honest answer is that there isn't anything to say that makes it right." She paused. "But I want you to know that I knew it was wrong at the time. When Vivian suggested it, I knew it was wrong and I went along with it, and I've thought about that more than you'd probably think." Elena looked at her sister. Rosalind had always been harder to read than Vivian because she was quieter about her choices, and quiet choices had a way of accumulating without being examined. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. "Because you told Vivian you weren't asking for an apology," Rosalind said. "And I'm not offering one exactly. I'm just telling you I knew, because I think you should know that too, that it wasn't thoughtlessness." She stopped. "I'm not sure that makes it better." "It doesn't make it better," Elena said, "but it makes it more honest." She considered her sister. "Stay for the winter, Rosalind. You and Clara and your mother. Don't go back east until spring." Rosalind blinked. "You're asking us to stay?" "I'm saying the roads will be difficult by January, and the rail connections are uncertain, and you might as well be somewhere useful while you're here. There's work enough for everyone." Elena looked back at her log. "Clara can help with Lucy. Clara was always better with children than any of us. And you can help with the correspondence. I have more of it than I can manage alone right now." Rosalind was quiet for a long moment. "You're giving us a chance to be useful," she said, "instead of just guests to be accommodated." "Yes," Elena said, "because that's the only thing that will actually change anything, not the conversations, the work." She turned a page in the log. "Think about it." Rosalind thought about it for approximately 30 seconds. "All right," she said. "Yes." She left. Elena wrote a number in the log. Then she stopped and looked at the number without seeing it for a moment. thinking about Rosalind saying, "I knew it was wrong at the time," and the specific loneliness of a younger self who had known that the people around her knew and had done it anyway. She wrote the next number, then the next. By the time Gideon came to find her for supper, she had finished the week's accounts, drafted 2 pieces of correspondence, and begun the revised budget projection for the first quarter of the coming year. He stood in the office doorway and looked at her with the expression that was the real one, not the precursor to it, the thing itself. "How are you?" he said. She thought about the question the way he always thought about questions. "Better than I expected," she said, "which is probably the best I could have hoped for." He nodded. "Supper's ready." "1 minute." She finished the line she was on, capped her pen, and closed the log. She stood up and straightened the edge of it against the table. The same gesture she made every evening, the same small act of order against the natural tendency of things to drift. She walked past him into the hallway, and he fell into step beside her, and they went to supper together in the house they had built, toward the sound of voices, Lucy's and Clara's, and the lower register of Rosalind saying something to their mother, filling the rooms in a way that was different from the silence she'd inherited and different again from the noise she'd grown up in, something in between, something that was its own thing entirely. She went in. Clara was the one who surprised her most. Elena had expected Vivian to be the difficult one, and Vivian was difficult, in the specific way of someone who had built a persona over decades and was now quietly, privately, dismantling parts of it without wanting anyone to notice the demolition work happening. She expected Rosalind to be the observer, and Rosalind was, cataloging everything with her quiet eyes and saying less than she thought, which was familiar. She expected her mother to be exactly what her mother had always been, which was a woman who survived by not fully committing to any position, and her mother was that too exactly, sitting in the ranch kitchen with her hands folded and her opinions carefully unvoiced. But Clara was 23 years old and had come west expecting to find her oldest sister diminished, and instead found something that knocked her off balance in a way she didn't know how to manage gracefully. She followed Lucy around the first 2 days with the helpless quality of someone who had found the most interesting thing in the room. Lucy tolerated this with the patience of a child who had learned to assess adults carefully before deciding how much access to grant them, and by the 3rd day had apparently decided Clara was acceptable because she showed her the stone collection. Elena was passing the doorway of Lucy's room when it happened. She didn't stop. She kept walking, but she heard Lucy's voice, very precise, explaining the organizational system. "This one is from the creek. This one Pete found in the north pasture. This one I had before, from when I was little." That last category, Elena knew, meant before her mother left, and she heard Clara receive it without flinching or redirecting, which was exactly right. Later, at the kitchen table, Clara said to Elena, "She told me about the stones." "She tells people she trusts about the stones," Elena said. Clara looked at her hands. She was the youngest, and had always been the most openly feeling of the 4 of them. She hadn't had time yet to learn all the ways to cover it up. "I didn't think you'd have a life like this," she said. I don't know what I thought. Something harder, something lonelier." "It was hard," Elena said. "The first winter especially. But you stayed. There was nothing to go back to." She said it without self-pity because it was simply true. "And there was something here worth staying for." Clara looked up. "Are you happy?" Elena thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved, which was something she did about most things and which had always made her sisters impatient when they were young. "Yes," she said, "most of the time. And the times I'm not unhappy for any reason that can't be worked on." She looked at her youngest sister. "That's a different thing than what I had before." Clara nodded slowly. She seemed to be working through something. "I want you to know I didn't think it was funny," she said. "When Vivian suggested sending your name, I laughed because everyone else was laughing, and I didn't know how not to, but I knew it wasn't right, and I didn't say so, and that's something I've thought about." She stopped. "That probably doesn't help anything." "It doesn't unhappen it," Elena said carefully, "but it's honest, and I'd rather have honest than comfortable." She reached across and put her hand briefly over Clara's. The way you touch someone when you want them to know you've heard them without making the moment bigger than it needs to be. "Help Lucy with her lessons this afternoon. She's been working through fractions, and she's frustrated with them. You were always better at explaining things patiently than anyone in our family." Clara looked startled to be told she was better at something. Then she nodded and went to find Lucy, and Elena went back to the accounts. And the afternoon passed with the sound of Clara's voice from the back room saying, "Fractions just mean parts of a whole, see?" And Lucy's occasional impatient responses, and Elena worked through a column of numbers and felt something in the house that she had no precise word for. A quality of fullness, maybe. Not comfort. More than that. The Bennett women stayed through January. The roads closed in earnest mid-month, which Elena had predicted, and nobody said anything about leaving after that because there was nothing to say. The decision had been made by the weather, and everyone was privately relieved not to have to make it themselves. It wasn't easy. She had not expected it to be easy, and she had not wanted easy because easy didn't change anything. There were evenings when the tension in the front room was thick enough to notice. Vivian going quiet in the particular way that meant she was holding something back. Their mother making small, unnecessary adjustments to the arrangement of things on the mantel. Rosalind watching the whole situation with her measured eyes and not intervening. There were days when Elena came in from a long morning of work to find that someone had rearranged the kitchen in a way that made no practical sense, and she had to decide in real time whether the rearrangement was an honest attempt to help or a territorial claim, and 9 times out of 10 it was the former, even though it felt like the latter. She said nothing about the kitchen. She put things back where they were useful, quietly, the next time she needed them. Gideon watched all of this with the steadiness that was his defining quality and said very little. What he did, which Elena noticed and was grateful for without saying so, was make himself consistently present in the evenings without inserting himself into the family dynamics. He sat with them. He was civil and direct with her sisters, in the way he was civil and direct with everyone. He didn't perform warmth he didn't feel, but he also didn't make anyone feel unwelcome in his home, because it was his home and he had chosen to let them be in it. That choice was visible in how he carried himself, and Elena thought her family could feel it even if they couldn't name it. The evening that shifted things, the evening that changed the specific quality of the tension in the house, from something that had to be managed to something that was beginning, slowly, to resolve, was a Wednesday in the 3rd week of January. Lucy had a nightmare. This happened occasionally, less often now than it had in the early months, but still sometimes. She'd wake somewhere between midnight and 2 in the morning, and the sound of it would travel through the house in the particular way that sounds do in structures built for quiet. Elena was usually awake before Lucy finished crying because she'd learned Lucy's rhythms and her own body had adjusted to them, and she would go to the child's room and sit with her until the dream released its grip. That night, she came out of her own room and found Vivian already in the hallway. They looked at each other in the dark. Neither of them said anything. Elena went to Lucy's room, and Vivian, after a moment, followed and stood in the doorway while Elena sat on the edge of Lucy's bed and talked her down from wherever the nightmare had taken her. Not with false reassurance, not with it was just a dream, but with the specific grounded presence that Lucy responded to, her voice low and matter-of-fact, her hand on Lucy's back. It took about 20 minutes. Lucy went back to sleep holding the gray quartz stone, which she'd reached for automatically in the dark, and found where it always was. Elena came out of the room and pulled the door to, and found Vivian still in the hallway, leaning against the wall with her arms crossed over her robe, and an expression that was entirely unguarded in a way Elena had never once seen on her sister's face in 30 years of living. "She does that often?" Vivian said, very quiet. "Less than she used to." Vivian looked at the closed door. "What does she dream about?" "I don't ask," Elena said. "She tells me sometimes after. Usually it's something mundane that her mind has made frightening. Sometimes it's her mother." She paused. "The stone helps. I don't know why exactly. It's just something solid she can hold on to." Vivian was quiet for a long time. The house settled around them, the particular cold weather sounds of old wood contracting in the night. "I wasn't good at this kind of thing," Vivian said finally. The "I wasn't" was interesting, past tense, as if she'd already made some interior accounting. "When you were sick as a child, when Clara had her fevers. I never knew what to do. I just left the room and let you handle it." "I know," Elena said. "I told myself you were better at it, that it was your thing." She stopped. "But that was just a way of not having to do something uncomfortable." Elena looked at her sister in the dark hallway, of a house in Wyoming, 3 states from where they'd grown up, in the middle of a night that had called one of them and found the other already there. "Vivian," she said, "I'm not going to spend the rest of my life relitigating the past with you. I don't have the energy for it, and I don't think it would help either of us." She looked at her steadily. "What I want to know is whether the person standing in this hallway right now is the same person who would use her little sister as a punchline, or someone different." Vivian didn't answer right away. Elena had not expected her to. She knew her sister well enough to know that quick answers from Vivian were always performances, and she didn't want a performance. She wanted the slow, true thing. "I'm working on being different," Vivian said. "I can't promise I'm there yet." "That's honest," Elena said. "That's enough for now." They went back to their respective rooms, and neither of them mentioned it in the morning, but something had changed in the specific texture of how Vivian moved through the house after that. A slight softening in the angles of it, a decreased need to fill every silence with something sharp. The roads opened in the first week of February. They were passable, which was not the same as clear, but passable enough for a wagon to the station and a train east. Their mother came to Elena the evening before and held her hands in the way that she had always held Elena's hands. Not with the ease of long practice, but with the effortful care of someone who knew they'd missed many opportunities to do this and was trying to make something count. "I know I wasn't," she started. "Mama," Elena said, "go home and rest. Follow the plan I gave you. Write me if the numbers don't make sense." She looked at her mother's face, the age in it, the familiar shape of features she'd looked at all her life. "Come back in summer. Lucy would like that. She liked having people in the house." Her mother's eyes went bright. She squeezed Elena's hands and then let go, which was the most direct expression of feeling Elena had ever received from her, and she took it for what it was. Rosalind's goodbye was characteristic, a brief, firm embrace and a look that communicated more than she said. "The correspondence work was useful," she said. "I'd like to continue it if you have it. I can do it from back east." "I'll send what I can," Elena said. "Good." Rosalind started to turn, then stopped. "You know Fitch has been recommending you to every attorney in the territory. I've heard something about that. You could do this professionally, what you did with the Crow situation, with a formal arrangement." "I'm thinking about it," Elena said. "It's a bigger change than it sounds." "Most things that matter are." Rosalind picked up her bag. "Don't wait too long to decide. You have a habit of taking longer to claim things than you should." It was the most direct piece of personal observation Rosalind had ever offered her, and Elena received it with the particular surprise of hearing something true said by someone you hadn't expected to see you clearly. "I'll keep that in mind," she said. Clara cried. Elena had expected this. She held her youngest sister for a moment and let her cry and didn't say anything to stop it, because Clara's feelings had always needed room to move through her rather than being redirected, and giving them room was the kindest thing. "Come back in summer," Elena said. "Both of you. Bring Mama." Vivian was last. She stood at the door with her coat on and her bag in hand and looked at Elena with the expression she'd been building toward since the hallway conversation, stripped of the performance, just the face underneath it, which was the face of a woman who had been genuinely intelligent her whole life, and had spent most of it aimed in the wrong direction, and was beginning, at 41, to think about what else she might do with what she had. "I'm going to tell the story differently," Vivian said. "When people ask about you, how you came to be here." "You don't have to tell it at all," Elena said. "I know, but I want to tell it right." She paused. "The true version is better anyway. A woman who answered a stranger's letter with complete honesty and built all of this from it. That's a better story than the joke version." Elena looked at her sister. "It is," she agreed. Vivian went out to the wagon. Elena stood in the doorway until the wagon was down the road and the sound of it had faded into the ordinary sounds of the ranch. Then she went inside because there was work to do and the morning was moving on without her. She found Lucy at the kitchen table, eating breakfast and reading the primer she'd already read twice through. Lucy looked up. "They're gone," she said. It wasn't a question. "They're gone," Elena confirmed. "Will they come back?" "In summer, probably." Lucy considered this. "Clara's all right," she said, which was high praise in Lucy's vocabulary. "She is," Elena said. "Is Vivian all right?" Elena thought about it honestly. "She's getting there," she said. "It's a slow process for some people." Lucy nodded with the gravity of someone who understood slow processes from personal experience. She went back to her primer. Elena poured coffee and sat across from her and opened the week's accounts, and they worked together in the particular silence that wasn't quiet at all. It was full of the sounds of the house, the stove, the distant voices of the hands starting their morning, the land outside doing what land does in early February, cold and patient and indifferent to the small human dramas playing out on top of it. It was March when Aldous Fitch came to the ranch in person, which he had never done before. He came with a formal document and the slightly uncomfortable bearing of a man who is about to propose something he's uncertain will be received well. He sat at the kitchen table and Elena poured coffee and waited. "There's a situation in Laramie County," he said. "A widow named Sorensen. She has a water rights dispute that's been moving through the territorial court for 2 years, and the documentation is, I'll be direct, it's a mess. 3 lawyers before me have looked at it, and none of them have found the thread." He set his coffee down. "I believe you would find it." "You're asking me to consult on a case," Elena said. "I'm asking you to consult on this case, and if it goes the way I expect it to consider doing this formally." He said formally, with the careful emphasis of a man who had thought about the word choice. "I've spoken to several attorneys in the territory. There's an appetite for a document specialist, someone who approaches land and financial records the way you do. Not as a lawyer, as an analyst. It's a different thing, but it's not a lesser thing." Elena looked at the document he'd brought. She thought about what Rosalind had said at the door. "You have a habit of taking longer to claim things than you should." "I'll look at the Sorensen matter," she said. "Let me see the documentation." Fitch produced a considerably thicker folder than she'd expected. She looked at the thickness of it and then looked at him. "This is what 3 lawyers gave up on?" "4, counting me, before I came to you." She opened the folder. She looked at the first 3 pages. She looked up. "Come back in a week," she said. It took her 6 days. The Sorensen water rights case had the same quality as the Crow situation. Not a simple error, but a layered one, where the original documentation was sound and everything wrong with it had been added afterward by people who were betting on the complexity discouraging close examination. Elena found the original grant language buried in the 4th box of documents, an 1869 water agreement that predated the disputed allocation by 5 years and established a right of continuous use that the subsequent paperwork had been carefully constructed to obscure without technically falsifying. She wrote the summary. She sent it to Fitch. His response arrived in 4 days, which was fast for Fitch, and it said the case had been resolved in the Sorensen widow's favor within 72 hours of the summary reaching the court, and that he would like to discuss terms. What followed was not a legal practice, not exactly. What it was, in the language of the territory, was a service, a document analysis service that operated out of the ranch office and took on cases by referral only, which Fitch managed, because Elena had no interest in managing the business side of something if there was someone qualified to do it. She set her own terms. She chose what she took on. She worked at her own pace, and the work she did at Mercer Ranch, the accounts, the management, the daily architecture of the operation, came first, always, without negotiation. Gideon's response to the arrangement was to build her a better office. He did it over 3 weeks in April, expanding the ranch office into the adjacent storage room, putting in 2 additional windows for light, building shelves to her specifications. He asked her exactly once what she wanted, and then built what she'd described, and the result was a room that was purely functional and exactly right for what she needed, and had no pretensions to anything it wasn't. She stood in the completed room on the first morning and ran her hand along the new shelving and thought about the back room in her family's house where she had kept the ledger and done the invisible work for years, and then thought about this room with her name on the door in Gideon's handwriting, which he'd put there because he said people coming to see her should know where to go. She thought about the envelope hitting her face. She thought about Vivian's casual hand. She thought, and this is where it led, not without cost, not without the hard winters and the Crow dispute and the long, slow work of building trust with a child who had been taught to protect herself from it, not without the night in the hallway and the supper tables where the silence had weight, and the mornings when Wyoming asked more of her than she was sure she had, not without the letters she'd written and the work she'd done and the loneliness she'd felt sometimes in the middle of the biggest landscape she'd ever lived inside. But here. Gideon came to the doorway of the office. He looked at her standing in the middle of the room and said, "Does it work?" "It's exactly right," she said. "Good." He didn't move from the doorway. He had the expression that was the real one, not the precursor, not the almost, the thing itself. Fitch is saying you're the best analytical mind working land cases in the territory. Fitch is generous. Fitch is stingy with compliments. He told me himself he doesn't say things he doesn't mean because it makes people complacent. He looked at her steadily. He means it. She looked at her husband. This man she had come to through a stranger's cruel joke and her own stubborn honesty, who kept records even when he didn't look at them, who had built her an office because she needed better light, who had stood in a hallway reading a letter designed to end her life here, and had chosen, instead, to stay with what he knew to be true. This man who was not perfect and never performed at being more than he was, whose first question when she'd done something difficult was never, "How did you know how to do that?" but always, "Are you all right?" Who had held space for Lucy's long, slow healing and for Elena's complicated family and for the entire improbable enterprise of a marriage built on letters and hope and the basic radical act of telling the truth. "I know," she said. "You can tell him I'm grateful." "Tell him yourself. He's coming for supper." She almost laughed. It wasn't a large thing, just the small surprised sound of a woman who had spent years not laughing easily and was now doing it more often than she'd expected to. "Fine," she said. "Then I need to finish the Harmon County referral before 6. She went to her desk. He went back to whatever he'd been doing, the office filled with morning light through the new windows, falling across the organized shelves and the labeled document boxes and the open ledger on the desk. Lucy appeared in the doorway at mid-morning, which she did most days now, but not to interrupt, but to occupy the same space, which was how Lucy showed affection, through consistent chosen proximity. She climbed into the chair in the corner that had become, without discussion, hers, and opened the schoolbook she was working through and read, and the office held both of them in a comfortable working silence. After a while, Lucy said, without looking up from her book, "Aunt Clara wrote me a letter." Elena looked up. "She did?" "She taught me fractions, and she said she would write, and she did." Lucy turned a page. "She says she's coming in July. She told me the same thing." "Good." Lucy was quiet for a moment. "Can I tell her about the stones when she comes, properly, like explain the whole system?" "I think she'd like that very much," Elena said. Lucy went back to her book. Elena went back to the Harmon County referral. Outside, the Wyoming spring was doing what Wyoming spring did. Cold still, unpredictable, beautiful in the way of things that don't ask permission and don't adjust themselves for observers. The eastern pasture, all 2,000 saved acres of it, was beginning to green at the edges. The first of the spring cattle work was 2 weeks out. Clyde had the list of what needed to happen, and Elena had the supply orders already drafted, and Gideon had the schedule built, and none of it was simple, and all of it was theirs. At some point during the middle of the afternoon, Elena put her pen down and looked at the room around her. The work on the desk, the light on the shelves, Lucy reading in the corner chair, and thought about all the different things that could have happened instead. The letter could have been thrown away. She could have gone back instead of forward. The train could have carried her to something else entirely. The ground at Mercer Ranch could have been harder than it was. She thought about the people who had called her invisible, and the people who had asked her to disappear into the background of their lives, and how thoroughly, comprehensively, she had refused. Not with anger, not with performance, just with the basic persistence of a person who kept showing up the same way every day and doing the work that was in front of her and telling the truth when it was required and sometimes when it wasn't. That was the thing she had understood slowly over the course of a year that had asked a great deal of her. Visibility wasn't something other people gave you. It wasn't granted. You didn't earn it by being impressive or beautiful or loud enough to demand it. You built it the way you built everything worth having, incrementally, imperfectly, by doing the same thing tomorrow that you'd done today, by being the same person in difficult circumstances that you were in easy ones, by letting the work be its own argument. She had never set out to become the woman people asked for by name when they had a document problem they couldn't solve. She had never planned to be the person Clyde Birch told his wife about, and she knew he'd told his wife about her because Mrs. Birch had come to visit in March, and had looked at Elena with the specific respect of someone who had been given an accurate description of a person and found the person larger than the description. She had not planned any of it. She had just answered honestly when honesty was possible and done the work when work was in front of her, and refused to let cruelty define what she was worth. And the life that had come from those ordinary, unglamorous choices was sitting around her in this room right now. In Lucy reading in the corner chair, in the new shelves built to her specifications, in the organized record of a ranch that was solvent and respected and continuing to grow, in the letters from Rosalind that arrived now every 2 weeks with the correspondence work and sometimes, increasingly, with other things. Observations, questions, the slow, uncertain reach of a sister who was learning, at 38, to be direct. None of it was finished. That was the other thing she had understood. The thing that nobody told you, or maybe told you and you couldn't hear until you'd lived enough to know it was true. Nothing finished. Lucy would have other nightmares. The accounts would have other crises. The land would produce other Darius Crows, other challenges designed by people who bet on the complexity discouraging examination. Her relationship with Vivian would continue to be imperfect and effortful, and would require her to extend, again and again, something that was harder than forgiveness and more durable. A continued willingness to see the person as they were now, rather than only as they had been. None of it finished. It just kept going, and you kept showing up for it, and that was what a life was. Elena picked up her pen. She finished the last section of the Harmon County referral, checked it twice, and set it aside. "Lucy," she said. Lucy looked up. "We should start thinking about supper. Fitch is coming." Lucy closed her book. She had the expression she wore when she was organizing her thoughts, which was the expression she wore when something mattered to her. "Elena," she said. She still said Mama sometimes, but she said Elena too, both of them, interchangeably, and Elena had never asked her to choose. "Were you scared? When you first came here?" Elena thought about the train platform, the iron sky, the 2 bags and the bundle of letters, and the $23 in the tin. "Yes," she said. "Quite scared. But you stayed anyway." "I stayed anyway." Lucy thought about this with the complete seriousness she brought to things she was actually working through. "I think that's brave," she said. Not as flattery, as a conclusion she had reached independently and was reporting. "I think it was mostly just not having anywhere better to go," Elena said. "Maybe that's what brave is," Lucy said, and got up from the corner chair and went to the kitchen to start supper, leaving Elena sitting at her desk with that sentence and the particular quality of late afternoon light coming through the new windows onto the organized shelves of a life she had built from a cruel joke and a true answer, and the long, ordinary courage of a woman who had simply refused, again and again and again, to become nothing. She sat with it for a moment. Then she capped her pen, closed the ledger, and went to help with supper.